In the last hours of May 29th, 1453, a monk named Gennadios gathered what he could carry and ran, not toward the sea walls, not toward the harbor where Venetian galleys still burned, but toward the scriptorium. Because what he understood, in the chaos of that final night, was something that soldiers never do, that a city can be rebuilt from stone, but a text, once lost, is lost forever. He had watched the sky turn orange over the Golden Horn. He had heard the Ottoman drums, and still he went back to the book. Constantinople, for 1100 years, was the greatest library civilization had ever assembled. Not a metaphor, a literal archive, a city where emperors competed to collect the rarest scrolls in the known world, where monks copied Plato by candlelight through winter nights, where scribes so precise that modern philologists can trace their handwriting across centuries, sat in silent rooms and transferred, word by word, letter by letter, the entirety of ancient Greek thought from crumbling papyrus onto imperishable parchment. Without those rooms, without those men, you would never have read a line of Archimedes, nor of Sophocles, nor of Plato. Today, across the monasteries of Mount Athos, the isolated peninsula in northern Greece where time moves differently and women are still forbidden to enter, sit more than 11,000 manuscripts. Thousands of them have never been fully catalogued. Hundreds remain unread by modern scholars. The monks who guard them do not consider themselves archivists. They consider themselves keepers of the faith, and they are not always willing to share what they keep. This is a story about what was saved, what was destroyed, and what, nearly 6 centuries after the fall of Constantinople, the Orthodox Church has still not shown the world. To understand what was at stake, you have to understand what Constantinople actually held. Emperor Constantius II founded the Imperial Library around 357 AD, not as a prestige project, but as a rescue operation. Ancient papyrus scrolls were physically decaying. The great library at Alexandria was already gone. Constantius hired the philosopher Themistius to oversee a scriptorium, a room where skilled calligraphers would copy the most important works of Greek antiquity onto parchment, which could survive for centuries rather than decades. By the 5th century, the collection had grown to an estimated 120,000 volumes. 120,000 volumes. For context, most monasteries in medieval Western Europe owned fewer than 300 books. The monastery of Patmos, itself considered a significant library, held 330 manuscripts by 1201 AD. Constantinople was not a library. It was a civilization's entire memory, compressed into one place. And it held things that nowhere else held. Works by Archimedes on the mathematics of infinity, centuries before calculus was invented. All 37 plays attributed to Sophocles, though only 7 survive today. The complete dialogues of Plato, astronomical tables by Ptolemy, medical treatises by Galen, poetry lost to the rest of the world. What made Byzantine preservation extraordinary was not just the collecting, it was the copying. The monks and scribes of Constantinople developed a revolution in written technology during the 9th and 10th centuries. They invented Greek minuscule script, a smaller, connected style of handwriting that allowed a scribe to fit far more text on each page, work more efficiently, and reduce the cost of parchment, which was made from animal skin and was not cheap. During the period scholars call the Macedonian Renaissance, under emperors like Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, hundreds of ancient texts were systematically copied in this new script. It was an intentional, state-sponsored rescue of classical learning. The monasteries were as important as the palace. The monastery of Studios in Constantinople had a scriptorium where Saint Theodore the Studite, who lived from 758 to 826, established the rule that a well-stocked library was essential for monastic life. Monks at Studios had a reading day where they would select books from sunrise to sunset. The Great Lavra on Mount Athos, founded in 963, accumulated nearly 1,000 manuscripts within its first 2 centuries. These were not passive collections. They were living archives, constantly copied, annotated, and debated. Then came the Crusaders. On the 12th of April, 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade, men who had taken the cross to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, breached the sea walls of Constantinople. What followed was 3 days of looting and destruction that stunned even the medieval world. The Byzantine historian Nikitas Choniatis wrote an eyewitness account of the horror. Sacred objects smashed, relics torn apart, silver stripped from altars. Books, manuscripts representing centuries of careful copying, were burned, scattered, and stolen. The imperial library, which had survived fires and sieges for 800 years, did not survive 3 days of Christian soldiers. Historians debate exactly how much was lost in 1204. The honest answer is, we do not know, because we cannot count what no longer exists. What we do know is that Byzantine scribes in the 14th century, during the period of Latin occupation and its aftermath, were working at frantic pace to rebuild what had been destroyed. The Patriarch, Gregory II of Cyprus, who served from 1283 to 1289, personally paid scribes out of his own funds to copy and gather manuscripts to restock the library. The fact that such efforts were necessary tells you everything about the scale of the loss. The second catastrophe came 249 years later. On the 29th of May, 1453, after a 53-day siege, the Ottoman army of Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, direct continuation of Rome, the empire that had preserved Greek civilization for 1,000 years, ended in a single morning. What happened to the manuscripts that remained is a question scholars are still trying to answer. Some were burned, some were carried away as war booty, and a remarkable number, more than anyone expected, were saved by people who understood exactly what they held. Mehmed II himself, the conqueror, was not indifferent to learning. He spoke Greek. He collected books. His personal library eventually held over 8,000 manuscripts in Persian, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Latin, and Greek. Some of the Byzantine manuscripts that survived the fall of Constantinople were absorbed into the Ottoman imperial collection. But the key word is some. The great body of what had once been the imperial library, reduced already by the Crusaders, further depleted by the chaos of the final siege, dispersed in every direction, some west, some east, some into private hands, and some, irrecoverably, into silence. The most important rescue was organized before the city fell. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek-born scholar and bishop who had attended the Council of Florence and remained in Italy, spent the decades after 1453 systematically collecting every Greek manuscript he could find. He tracked them across Greece, Italy, and the Greek exile communities. By 1468, he had assembled between 482 and over 1,000 codices. Sources differ slightly. And he donated the entire collection to the Republic of Venice. His explicit reason? To create an ark for Greek civilization, a place where the heritage of Byzantium could survive the Ottoman conquest. That collection became the Bibliotheca Marciana, which exists to this day. Other manuscripts reached the Vatican. Pope Nicholas V had already been purchasing Greek manuscripts from the remains of the imperial library before Constantinople fell. By 1455, just 2 years after the conquest, the Vatican library held 1,200 books, of which 400 were in Greek. Many had come from Constantinople directly. The Vatican's collection today includes masterpieces of Byzantine illumination, early biblical manuscripts, and scientific texts whose origin traces back through the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Some of that collection is accessible to accredited scholars. Some remains in restricted archives that are opened only rarely, or not at all. And then there is Mount Athos. The 20 monasteries of the Athenite Peninsula collectively hold more than 11,000 manuscripts. The Great Lavra alone holds 2,800 codices, including 500 on parchment and 51 liturgical scrolls dating from the 10th to the 15th century, one of them 10 meters long. Vatapedi Monastery holds over 35,000 manuscripts and rare books, These numbers are staggering, and yet thousands of these documents have never been fully described, never fully cataloged, never photographed at high resolution. Digitization projects are ongoing, but they are far from complete. Much of what Mount Athos holds, the world has simply never seen. The question this documentary asks is not a conspiracy. The Orthodox Church does not have a secret agenda. What it has is something more interesting and more complicated. An archive shaped by faith rather than scholarship, guarded by men whose relationship with these texts is devotional rather than academic, operating under rules of access that predate the modern concept of open research. Some of what they hold may be extraordinary, some may be routine. We do not know, because we have not been allowed to look. This is the real mystery of the lost manuscripts of Constantinople. Not what was destroyed, but what was saved, and whether we will ever be permitted to see it. To speak of the lost manuscripts of Constantinople, you must first understand what Constantinople actually was, and what it was not. It was not simply a great city in the way that Rome had been great through military conquest and administrative genius. Constantinople was something the ancient world had never quite produced before, a city explicitly designed to be the memory of civilization. When Emperor Constantine the Great dedicated the city in 330 AD, he filled it with statues plundered from across the Greek world, not as trophies, but as repositories. The past was not to be forgotten. It was to be gathered, maintained, and transmitted. The decision to establish a formal imperial library came under Constantine's son, Constantius II, around 357 AD. The philosopher Themistius was put in charge. His mandate was specific: transfer the great works of Greek antiquity from deteriorating papyrus scrolls onto more durable parchment. Papyrus is made from a reed plant, grown almost exclusively in Egypt. By the 4th century, with Egypt increasingly disconnected from the empire's supply lines, papyrus was becoming scarce, and the scrolls written on it were crumbling. Parchment, made from stretched animal skin, could last for centuries. The library was not a luxury. It was a rescue mission. By the time of Emperor Valens, who ruled from 364 to 378, 4 Greek and 3 Latin scribes were permanently employed by the imperial library, working daily to expand the collection. By the 5th century, estimates placed the collection at approximately 120,000 volumes. To put that number in perspective, this was before the era of printing. Every single book in that library had been copied by hand. Every word had been traced by a human being with a stylus or quill. The labor represented by 120,000 volumes is almost unimaginable. What did those volumes contain? The record is incomplete. We cannot reconstruct the full catalog because the catalog itself was lost. But from surviving references and the works that did eventually reach Western Europe through Byzantine intermediaries, we know the scope. The complete works of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. All of Plato's dialogues, every one of them that we possess today, survived because Byzantine scribes copied them, since Western Europe in the early medieval period possessed, at most, a partial Latin translation of the Timaeus, the tragedies and comedies of the great Athenian dramatists, the mathematical works of Euclid, the astronomical tables of Ptolemy, the medical corpus of Hippocrates and Galen, the philosophical writings of Aristotle, and beyond the famous names, thousands of texts by authors whose very existence we know only because a Byzantine scholar quoted them, or because a single manuscript survived in a monastery library that no Western crusader thought to loot. These shadow figures of antiquity, historians, poets, philosophers, scientists, exist now only as names and footnotes. Their actual words are gone. We have no idea what we lost, because the loss was total. The Imperial Library's first near-death experience came not from a foreign army, but from within the empire itself. In 473 AD, a catastrophic fire swept through Constantinople. Ancient sources claimed that the blaze destroyed 120,000 volumes, essentially the entire collection, as it then stood. For centuries, this was taken as a definitive account of the library's destruction. Some historians still cite it as the end of the original collection, but the reality is more complicated and more human. The library did not simply vanish. Librarians and scribes had been working with these texts for generations. They knew what they held. When fire threatened, some volumes were moved. Others were duplicated. The passion for preservation that had built the library in the first place did not die with a single fire. Emperor Zeno, who came to power in 474, worked to rebuild the collection. Later emperors expanded it further. What this first fire teaches us is something essential about how books survive. They survive because individual human beings, scribes, monks, scholars, librarians, make the decision to save them. Not governments, not institutions, not policies, people. A monk who carries a manuscript out of a burning room, a scholar who copies a text before it deteriorates, a bishop who donates his savings to hire copyists. The history of manuscript preservation is not the history of grand institutional programs. It is the history of individual acts of devotion, repeated across centuries. This matters because it explains why the Orthodox Church, and specifically the monasteries of Mount Athos, became the ultimate repository of Byzantine textual heritage. The monasteries were not bureaucracies. They were communities of men who believed, literally and fervently, that the preservation of sacred and classical texts was part of their spiritual duty. When the empire fell apart around them, the monks kept copying. When crusaders looted the palace libraries, the monks on their isolated peninsula continued their work. When the Ottoman conquest ended the imperial line, the monasteries survived. They were the backup drive of Byzantine civilization, and they still are. By the 6th century, the monastery of Studios in Constantinople had become one of the most important scriptoria in the Christian world. Saint Theodore the Studite, its most influential abbot, born in 758, died in 826, insisted that a proper monastic library was not optional. His rule required that monks engage in daily reading. The Studios Scriptorium produced manuscripts that were distributed to monasteries across the Byzantine world, creating a network of copying centers that would prove crucial when any single library faced catastrophe. The genius of this network approach was redundancy. If one monastery burned, others held copies. If one collection was looted, another survived in a different location. The individual losses were still devastating. Each irreplaceable manuscript that burned represented a permanent reduction in human knowledge. But the network as a whole was resilient in a way that a single great library, however magnificent, could never be. The single most important period in the history of manuscript transmission happened not in antiquity, but in the 9th and 10th centuries, during what scholars call the Macedonian Renaissance. The Byzantine Empire, under the dynasty that began with Basil I in 867, experienced an extraordinary intellectual flowering. Emperors competed as patrons of scholarship. The imperial library was restored and expanded. And critically, Byzantine scholars developed a technological innovation that would shape everything that followed: Greek minuscule script. Before the 9th century, Greek was written in a style called majuscule, or uncial, large, separate capital letters that took up significant space on parchment. Minuscule script, smaller, connected letters with flowing ligatures between them, allowed scribes to write much faster and fit far more text on each page. For the manuscripts of antiquity, which were often written on fragile or deteriorating papyrus in older scripts, the transition to minuscule meant that their contents could be copied onto fresh parchment efficiently and at lower cost. It was the ancient equivalent of compression software. Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos, who reigned from 913 to 959, is perhaps the most significant individual figure in this story. He was himself a scholar. He wrote encyclopedias on the administration of the empire, on court ceremonies, on military strategy. More importantly, he commissioned vast systematic programs of copying. Under his reign, Ancient texts that existed in single, crumbling copies were transcribed into fresh, minuscule manuscripts. The Archimedes Codex, the manuscript that would eventually become the Archimedes Palimpsest, was likely copied during this Macedonian Renaissance, sometime around the 10th century. That Archimedes Codex is one of the most significant manuscripts in the history of science. It contains 7 treatises by the ancient mathematician, including 2 works, the Ostomachion and the Method of Mechanical Theorems, that were thought to have been entirely lost to history. The Method of Mechanical Theorems, in particular, reveals that Archimedes was working with concepts of infinity and infinitesimals more than 1800 years before Newton and Leibniz independently invented calculus. The architecture of the Hagia Sophia was designed by Isidore of Miletus, who had access to Archimedes' work on geometry. That manuscript was copied in Constantinople around 950 AD. Without Byzantine scribes working in that 10th century scriptorium, those mathematical insights would never have been recovered. Beyond Archimedes, the list of what the Macedonian Renaissance preserved reads like a catalog of everything we value about ancient civilization. The complete plays of Aeschylus. 7 survive, chosen and copied during this period from a larger ancient corpus. The plays of Sophocles, again, 7 from a reported 123. The plays of Euripides, 19 survive, more than the others because Byzantine scholars seem to have favored his work. The complete dialogues of Plato, copied and recopied in Constantinople for 1,000 years before a single complete set reached Western Europe. The systematic works of Aristotle, transmitted through Constantinople into the Islamic world, and eventually back to Christian Europe, where they would reshape medieval philosophy. The Byzantines did not save all of this by accident. They saved it because they chose to. And that choice, made by emperors and monks and scribes across 600 years of deliberate cultural work, is why the Western tradition exists in the form it does. There is no better symbol of what was nearly lost, and of how improbably some things were saved, than the object known as the Archimedes palimpsest. The word palimpsest comes from the Greek, palin, meaning again, and cestos, meaning scraped. A palimpsest is a manuscript from which the original text has been scraped or washed away, so that the parchment can be reused. Parchment was expensive. In the medieval world, recycling it was common practice. Sometime in the 13th century, probably around 1229, scholars believe in Jerusalem, or possibly in a Palestinian monastery. A monk faced with a shortage of clean parchment did what monks had done for centuries. He took a stack of old manuscripts, scraped the ink from the pages, rotated the parchment 90 degrees, refolded it into new gatherings, and wrote a Christian prayer book over the erased text. He had no way of knowing, or perhaps he simply did not consider, that the manuscripts he was recycling included the only surviving copy of Archimedes' Method of Mechanical Theorems, the only surviving Greek text of On Floating Bodies, the only surviving copy of the Ostomachion, works that existed nowhere else on earth, not because they had been deliberately hidden, but because this particular copy was the last one. The prayer book sat in a monastery in the Middle East for centuries. In 1846, it surfaced in Constantinople at the library of the Matakion of the Holy Sepulchre, the Jerusalem Patriarchate's property in Constantinople. In 1906, the Danish philologist Johann Ludwig Heiberg examined it and realized, beneath the prayer book text, traces of a much older writing were visible to the naked eye. He transcribed what he could read and published his findings. The world learned that Archimedes had been hiding inside a prayer book for 700 years. Then the palimpsest vanished again. It reappeared in 1998 at Christie's auction house in New York, where it sold for $2 million to an anonymous American private collector. That collector, whose identity remains undisclosed, made the extraordinary decision to lend the manuscript to the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore for conservation and scholarly study. The manuscript was in terrible condition. A layer of forged gold leaf paintings had been added over the medieval prayer text, further obscuring the Archimedes writing beneath. Scientists at the Stanford synchrotron radiation light source used an X-ray beam to scan the manuscript, detecting iron atoms in the original Archimedes ink that were invisible to ordinary light. Ultraviolet and multispectral imaging revealed further text. And what they found changed the history of mathematics. The method of mechanical theorems revealed that Archimedes was manipulating actual infinities, sets of an infinite number of points, in his mathematical reasoning. He was doing this in the 3rd century BC. This is not what historians of mathematics had believed. The palimpsest rewrote the timeline of human intellectual history, and it almost didn't exist. It survived only because it was turned into something else. The monk who scraped it didn't know what he was destroying. The scholars who studied it almost didn't have access. The collector who bought it could have kept it locked in a vault. At every turn, the survival of this document depended on individuals making the right decision for reasons that had nothing to do with institutional mandate. The catastrophe of 1204 remains one of the most debated events in the history of Christianity. The Fourth Crusade was launched in 1202 with the stated purpose of retaking Jerusalem from Muslim control. What happened instead was that a Christian army, financed largely by the Republic of Venice, ended up attacking the largest Christian city in the world. The sequence of events involved debt, political manipulation, and a disputed Byzantine succession. Historians still argue about whether Venice engineered the diversion deliberately or whether it was opportunistic. What is not disputed is the result. On the 12th of April, 1204, after an initial failed assault and then a second successful breach of the sea walls, the Crusader army entered Constantinople. For 3 days, the 12th, 13th, and 14th of April, the city was subjected to systematic looting of a thoroughness that stunned contemporary observers. The Byzantine historian Nikitas Choniates, who witnessed the sack, wrote that the Crusaders outdid the barbarians in their destruction of sacred things, and that their behavior would have moved even a Turk to pity. What did 3 days of looting mean for the libraries? The honest answer is that we cannot be precise. The imperial library of the 4th century foundation had already been reduced, possibly severely, by the fire of 473 and subsequent events. Historian Donald Queller, one of the leading scholars of the Fourth Crusade, noted cautiously that there is no indication of the continued existence of a formal imperial library at the time of the sack. The library as a distinct institution may have already been absorbed into palace archives or dispersed among monastic collections. But that does not mean the manuscripts did not exist. It means they were distributed across the city, in the Hagia Sophia, in the Patriarchal Library, in the monasteries of Constantinople, in private collections of the Byzantine aristocracy, in the scriptorium of Staudios. Manuscripts were everywhere, and they were vulnerable. When Crusader soldiers who could not read Greek tore apart a Byzantine church looking for gold, they would not have distinguished between a decorative cloth and a manuscript binding. They did not. The Patriarchal Library suffered greatly. The palace collections were looted. Private libraries of Byzantine nobles who fled or were killed were scattered. Fires set during the assault destroyed blocks of the city, and with them, whatever manuscripts had not been physically removed. The network of copying centers was disrupted. Monks fled. Some collections were hidden. Others were carried away to Venice, to Rome, to France. Not always by people who understood their value, sometimes by people who simply grabbed everything that appeared decorative. After the Crusaders established their Latin Empire of Constantinople, which lasted from 1204 to 1261, Byzantine intellectual life did not stop. It relocated. The exiled Byzantine court at Nicaea in Asia Minor became a refuge for scholars and a new center for manuscript production. Nicephorus Blemmydes, the great 13th century scholar and polymath, traveled across the former Byzantine territories in 1239 and 1240, spending, in his own words, a long time working extremely hard at finding books in Macedonia and Thessaly. He found them in countless profusion, which tells us that outside the capital, The provincial monastery libraries had survived relatively intact. The manuscripts of the Byzantine world were not all in Constantinople, and so they were not all lost. When the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople in 1261, the project of reconstruction included, as it always had in Byzantine history, the reconstruction of the libraries. Patriarch Gregory II of Cyprus, serving from 1283 to 1289, spent his own funds on hiring scribes to rebuild the patriarchal library. The work went on, but the losses of 1204 were real and irreversible. We will never know what Nikitas Chonits saw burning in the streets that April. The story of how Greek classical texts reached the Italian Renaissance is not a story of triumphant discovery. It is a story of diaspora. It began even before the fall of Constantinople, with a small wave of Byzantine scholars who traveled west for diplomatic and academic reasons, and who brought with them something more durable than any single manuscript: the ability to read Greek. Manuel Chrysoloras was born in Constantinople around 1350. He was a diplomat, a scholar, and a friend of the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos. In 1397, at the invitation of the Florentine humanist Coluccio Salutati, Chrysoloras traveled to Florence to accept the first professorship in Greek at a Western European university. He taught there from 1397 to 1400, and what he brought with him changed everything. Western European scholars had, for the most part, no access to Greek at all. They knew Aristotle through Arabic translations and Latin summaries. They knew Homer's name, but not his words. Chrysoloras could teach them Greek, and he brought Byzantine manuscript MS Palatinus Graecus, 88, to Italy as a teaching tool. The Erotemata, his Greek grammar textbook, circulated widely across Italy and was the first Greek grammar to be printed, around 1471. But his deeper legacy was the students he trained, men who could read the manuscripts that were beginning to arrive from the East, who could verify translations, who could distinguish genuine ancient texts from Byzantine copies. He died in 1415, 38 years before Constantinople fell. But the network he created was ready when the flood of Greek refugees arrived. After 1453, that flood was real. Greek scholars, scribes, monks, and aristocrats fled west carrying whatever they could. Constantinople's intellectual class was sophisticated and knew exactly which manuscripts were most valuable. Constantine Lascaris, born in Constantinople in 1434, and one of the most learned Greek scholars of the generation, fled to Italy after the fall. He eventually settled in Messina in Sicily, where he taught Greek, copied manuscripts himself, creating conjectural emendations in the margins of texts he copied, and accumulated a personal library of rare manuscripts on philosophy, science, and what he described as magic. He bequeathed his library to the Senate of Messina. After a revolt in 1674, it was confiscated by the Spanish and carried to Madrid, where it remains in the Spanish National Library. Georgios Plethon Gemistos represents perhaps the most poignant case. He was the greatest Platonist philosopher of the Byzantine world, and he died in 1452, just a year before Constantinople fell. He had spent his career in Maestras in the Peloponnese, not in Constantinople itself, and had attended the Council of Florence in 1438, where his lectures on Plato sparked the Platonic Academy of Cosimo de' Medici. Plethon had written a great philosophical work called the Book of Laws, the Nomoi, in which he argued for a kind of reformed paganism based on Platonic principles. He knew it was dangerous. After his death, the manuscript came into the possession of Princess Theodora, wife of Demetrios Palaiologos. When Morea fell to the Ottomans and Theodora fled, she brought the manuscript to Constantinople and gave it to the Patriarch Gennadios Scholarios. Scholarios was Plethon's old adversary, a former student turned theological opponent who believed the Book of Laws was a threat to Orthodox Christianity. In around 1460, he burned it. He burned the only copy. In a letter he wrote to the Exarch Joseph, which still survives, he described the contents chapter by chapter, providing summaries, so that posterity could know what the book argued even without being able to read it. He burned it, and then he wrote a description of what he had burned. The irony is almost unbearable. The text is gone, but the table of contents remains. Of all the individuals who worked to save the intellectual heritage of Constantinople, none was more systematic, more determined, or more successful than Basilios Bessarion, known in the West as Cardinal Bessarion. Born in Trebizond around 1399 or 1400, Bessarion was a Byzantine monk, bishop, and later Archbishop of Nicaea. He attended the Council of Florence in 1438 and 1439, where he argued, correctly, as history proved, that the Byzantine Empire needed Western support to survive, and that a union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches was necessary for political survival. He remained in Italy after the council, was made a cardinal by Pope Eugene IV, and never returned to Constantinople before it fell. The fall of 1453 devastated him personally. His letters from that period express grief of an intensity that goes beyond political calculation. He wrote that a great light had been extinguished in the world, but grief did not paralyze him. For the rest of his life, he died in 1472. He devoted his considerable resources and his position as a senior figure in the Catholic Church to a single purpose: building an ark for Greek civilization. He traveled, he wrote letters, he hired agents, he tracked down Greek manuscripts across the Italian peninsula, in the monasteries of Greece, in the refugee communities of Venice and Florence and Rome. When he learned that a particular monastery in Greece held a rare text, he found a way to acquire or copy it. When a Byzantine nobleman arrived in Italy carrying manuscripts as his only portable wealth, Bessarion was there to negotiate. His collection grew manuscript by manuscript, codex by codex, across decades of determined effort. By 1468, when he made his formal donation to the Republic of Venice, the collection was extraordinary. Various sources give different counts: between 482 Greek codices and 264 Latin, or possibly over 1,000 manuscripts in total, depending on how duplicates are counted and which sources are followed. The core claim in all accounts is the same. It was the largest and most systematically assembled collection of Greek manuscripts in Western Europe. Bessarion chose Venice deliberately. The city had the largest Greek expatriate community in Western Europe. It had historical, commercial, and cultural ties to the Byzantine Empire stretching back centuries. Venetians had been trading with Constantinople for generations, and some spoke Greek. It was, he argued in his donation letter, the closest thing to a second Byzantium that the Western world offered. He stipulated that the collection be made into a public library, accessible to all who wished to consult it. That library became the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana, the Marciana Library of Venice. It opened formally in 1563, nearly a century after Bessarion's death, in a building designed by Jacopo Sansovino. Today it holds over 13,000 manuscripts, the Bessarion bequest at its core. Scholars from around the world consult its holdings. The Greek texts it contains, copied by Byzantine scribes from originals that no longer exist, assembled by a man who understood that he was watching a civilization end, are the direct intellectual ancestors of the classical education that shaped the modern world. Bessarion understood something that institutions rarely do: that the window for rescue is always narrower than you think. He did not wait for a systematic program. He did not apply for grants. He used his own money, his own position, his own network, and he moved. That urgency is why the Marciana exists, and why we can still read what we can read. History tends to flatten the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople into a story of pure destruction. The end of Byzantium, the end of the manuscripts, the end of everything. The reality is considerably more nuanced, and the nuance matters if we are going to understand honestly where the manuscripts went. Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople at the age of 21 in 1453, was not what Western propaganda made him. He was multilingual. He spoke Greek, Serbian, and Persian, in addition to Turkish and Arabic. He was curious about history, about philosophy, about science. In the months after the conquest, he had Kritibolos of Imbros, a Greek scholar who chose to collaborate with the new order, write a history of his reign in classical Greek, in the tradition of Thucydides. He commissioned portraits of himself from Venetian painters. He had a working knowledge of Christian theology and engaged in religious debates with Greek Orthodox clerics. His library, which eventually numbered over 8,000 manuscripts, was deliberately multilingual. It contained works in Persian, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Latin, and Greek, including copies of Homer's Iliad and Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander the Great. He actively sought out Greek manuscripts after the conquest, having some rebound and preserved. The great part of whatever survived of the Byzantine imperial library was absorbed into the Ottoman Sultanic Library, not destroyed, but inaccessible to Western scholars for centuries. The Byzantine Patriarch Gennadios Scholarios, the same man who would burn Plethon's book, was appointed by Mehmed himself as the first Orthodox Patriarch under Ottoman rule. This arrangement, which the Ottomans called the Millet system, gave the Orthodox Church institutional survival within the Ottoman framework. The Patriarchate continued, its library continued, the Orthodox clergy continued copying manuscripts, maintaining liturgical traditions, and conducting their internal theological debates in Greek. But survival within the Ottoman system came with constraints that reshaped what the Church would become. The Patriarchate was a politically compromised institution from the beginning of the Ottoman period. It existed at the Sultan's pleasure, could be removed at the Sultan's will, and survived by demonstrating its usefulness to Ottoman administrative goals. This is not a criticism. It was the pragmatic reality of conquered peoples maintaining cultural and religious continuity under foreign rule. But it shaped what the patriarchal archives contain, and why access to them has always been complicated. The manuscripts that remained in Ottoman-controlled territories followed several paths. Some were held by the Patriarchate in Constantinople, modern Istanbul. Some passed into Ottoman archives, where Greek texts coexisted with Islamic legal documents in ways that scholars are still working to map. Some were held by Greek communities in the cities of the former empire, in Thessaloniki, in Alexandria, in the monasteries of Cappadocia, in the cave churches of Gurum, in the isolated communities of Anatolia that would persist for centuries before the population exchanges of the 20th century erased them. And some, an unknown number, undocumented in any surviving catalog, simply disappeared, sold to book dealers, given as gifts, carried by travelers whose movements no archive tracked, bound into household furniture when the parchment was more useful than the text. Lost not in dramatic fires, but in the quiet entropy of centuries passing without anyone who cared enough to maintain them. While Constantinople burned and was rebuilt and burned again, the monasteries of Mount Athos continued as they always had. The Athonite Peninsula, a finger of land extending south from Chalkidiki into the northern Aegean, had been a monastic community since at least the 9th century. The Great Lavra was founded in 963 by St. Athanasius the Athonite, with imperial support from Emperor Nikephoros Phocas. By the time Constantinople fell in 1453, there were already dozens of monasteries on the peninsula, established by Greeks, Georgians, Serbians, Bulgarians, and Russians. A kind of Orthodox international, bound together by shared faith and separated by language. Mount Athos was not immune to the disasters that struck Constantinople. It was raided by Catalan mercenaries in the early 14th century and suffered various political pressures under the Ottomans. But its essential character remained intact, a community of men who had withdrawn from the world precisely to pursue the life of prayer, study, and manuscript copying that the Byzantine monastic tradition demanded. When the empire fell, the monasteries continued. When the emperors were gone, the abbots remained. Today, the 20 monasteries of Mount Athos collectively hold more than 11,000 manuscripts. The numbers, when you examine them, monastery by monastery, are extraordinary. The Great Lavra alone holds 2,800 manuscript codices, including 500 on parchment, some of which are among the oldest intact manuscripts in existence. Its archive contains 200 Byzantine imperial documents, including chrysobulls, imperial decrees in golden ink on purple parchment. It holds 8,000 Greek documents and 4,000 in Slavonic, Turkish, and Romanian. 51 liturgical scrolls dating from the 10th to the 15th century, including one that measures 10 meters in length. Vatapedi Monastery, one of the wealthiest on the peninsula, holds over 35,000 manuscripts and rare books, a number that exceeds many national libraries. Iviron Monastery, founded by Georgian monks around 980 AD, holds 337 Byzantine manuscripts alongside its Georgian collection. The Kora Monastery of Constantinople, whose magnificent mosaics survive today as the Karia Museum in Istanbul, was restored by the great scholar Theodoros Metakaites in the early 14th century, and reportedly became the largest library in Constantinople at the time, surpassing even the combined imperial and patriarchal collections. The Kora Library has not survived as an institution, but some of what it held dispersed to the monasteries. The critical question about the Athos collections is not just what they hold, but what has been catalogued and what has not. Modern digitization efforts are ongoing. The Athos Digital Heritage Project digitized hundreds of thousands of items over a 4-year period. The Pendektis Digital Repository of the Hellenic Ministry of Culture hosts more than 5,000 Byzantine and post-Byzantine manuscripts from Athos and Patmos. The Library of Congress holds a microfilm collection of Athos manuscripts catalogued in the 1960s and 70s. These are real achievements, but the work is far from complete. Thousands of manuscripts have been photographed but not fully described. Hundreds have been examined cursorily by scholars granted limited access. The monastery libraries are not public institutions. They are sacred spaces that exist for monastic purposes, and access for outside researchers depends on the goodwill of individual abbots, the protocols of individual communities, and the logistics of reaching a peninsula where no woman may enter, and where even male visitors require a special permit called the diamanitarian, granted in limited numbers each day. Scholarship happens here, but slowly, and on the monastery's terms, not the scholars. In the Fanar district of Istanbul, what was once Constantinople, stands the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. The compound is small and embattled, a remnant of what was once the administrative heart of world orthodoxy, now surrounded by a Turkish city, subject to Turkish law, its future uncertain. The Patriarch himself resides there, along with a small monastic and clerical community, and in that compound sits the Patriarchal Library, perhaps the oldest continuously operating Christian library in existence. The Patriarchal Library traces its origin to the very founding of the Patriarchate, which is to say, to the early centuries of the Byzantine Empire. Its collections have been disrupted many times, by the Fourth Crusade, by the Ottoman conquest, by fires, by political pressures, by the declining fortunes of the Greek community in Istanbul across the 20th century. After the Turkish War of Independence and the population exchange of 1923, the Greek community of Istanbul contracted dramatically. The Patriarchate found itself governing a community that had shrunk from hundreds of thousands to a few thousand. Its library's resources contracted accordingly. What the Patriarchal Library holds today is not, by the standards of Mount Athos, enormous, but it holds things of extraordinary significance. Manuscripts that passed through the hands of the patriarchs of Constantinople across 15 centuries. Documents relating to the administration of the Orthodox Church under Byzantine and Ottoman rule. Theological texts, council records, correspondence between patriarchs and emperors, hagiographies, liturgical manuscripts, the archive of a church that has survived, in one form or another, since the 4th century. Access to the Patriarchal Library has been complicated for reasons that are both practical and political. The Patriarchate operates in a legally ambiguous situation within Turkey. Its theological school at Halki has been closed by Turkish authorities since 1971, and the Patriarchate has operated without the ability to formally train its clergy within Turkey for more than 50 years. In this context, the question of scholarly access to the library's holdings involves considerations that go beyond academic convenience. The Patriarchate has been careful about what it shares, and with whom, because it operates in a political environment where information can be weaponized. In 2021, the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Morgan Library and Museum in New York issued a joint statement announcing a collaboration to digitize portions of the patriarchal collection. This was presented as a significant opening, and it is, compared to what preceded it. But the full scope of what the patriarchal archives contain, what has been inventoried and what has not, what is available to scholars and what is not, these remain questions without fully public answers. Scholars who have been granted access describe an institution that is not secretive by intention, but is limited by resources, by the complexity of its political situation, and by a monastic culture that has never prioritized accessibility over devotion. The Vatican Apostolic Library is one of the oldest libraries in the world and contains one of the most significant collections of historical texts in existence. It was formally established in 1475 by Pope Sixtus IV, but its origins go back much further, and its Byzantine holdings are intimately connected to the fall of Constantinople. Pope Nicholas V, who served from 1447 to 1455, was a bibliophile and a humanist. Unusually so, for a pope of his era. He had spent time in Florence and absorbed the Renaissance's passion for ancient texts. When he became pope, he set about systematically expanding the papal library. Among his most significant acquisitions, he purchased manuscripts from the remnants of the Imperial Library of Constantinople. By 1455, just 2 years after the Ottoman conquest, the papal library held 1,200 books, of which 400 were in Greek. Many of those Greek manuscripts had come, directly or indirectly, through the channels opened by the fall of Byzantium. The Vatican's Byzantine collection today is extraordinary. It includes the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible, dating to the 4th century, written in Greek Ensile script. It includes the Vienna Dioscorides, a magnificently illuminated Byzantine herbal created around 512 AD in Constantinople for the princess Anicia Juliana, its miniature paintings representing the pinnacle of early Byzantine art. It includes thousands of Greek manuscripts that arrived through the various channels of the 15th century Byzantine diaspora, through Bessarian's network, through papal purchasing agents, through the donations of Greek scholars seeking patronage. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, distinct from the library, was opened to scholarly research in 1881 by Pope Leo XIII. But access remains carefully controlled. Researchers must apply with institutional affiliation, explain their scholarly project, and demonstrate specific need for materials held nowhere else. Only a small fraction of the 3,000 scholars who visit the Vatican Library each year work with its most restricted materials. The archives relating to the Church's own institutional history, including some holdings whose exact contents have not been publicly listed, remain subject to restrictions that are reviewed periodically, but not systematically opened. This is not a conspiracy. The Vatican's approach to its archives reflects centuries of institutional practice, shaped by the Church's understanding of its own history as both sacred and politically sensitive. The partial opening of the archives in 1881 was itself a major step that enabled decades of scholarship on medieval church history. Further openings have followed, but the process is measured against institutional imperatives: the protection of the Church's internal communications, the privacy of historical individuals, the sensitivity of documents relating to still contested historical controversies that do not always align neatly with scholarly convenience. For scholars interested specifically in Byzantine manuscripts, the Vatican's Greek collection is largely accessible, cataloged in detail, and has been significantly digitized in recent years. The Vatican Library's digitization program, DigiVatLib, has made tens of thousands of manuscripts available online. This is a genuine achievement, but the question of what remains restricted and why is one that the institution controls the answer to. By this point in the story, a question demands an honest answer. What does it actually mean to say that the Orthodox Church, or any church, refuses to reveal what it holds? Is that a fair characterization? And if not, what is the accurate version of what is happening? The most honest answer is this. The question of access to monastic and ecclesiastical manuscript collections is real. It is complicated, and it does not reduce to a simple story of deliberate concealment. What exists is a set of overlapping realities, each of which contributes to the situation. The first reality is institutional culture. The monasteries of Mount Athos are not archives. They are living religious communities, and their manuscript collections exist in service of that religious life. A monk at the Great Lavra does not think of himself as a custodian of humanity's intellectual heritage in the secular academic sense. He thinks of himself as a servant of God, maintaining the library as part of a monastic rule that has operated for over 1,000 years. When scholars request access, they are asking to insert academic priorities into a structure organized around entirely different priorities. The monks are not wrong to be cautious. The scholars are not wrong to want access. The tension is structural, not conspiratorial. The second reality is resources. Cataloging 11,000 manuscripts, many in damaged condition, requiring careful conservation before they can even be safely handled, requires money, expertise, and time that monastic communities do not automatically possess. The uncatalogued manuscripts of Mount Athos are not hidden. They are simply unprocessed. The monasteries have been, for decades, trying to accelerate digitization and cataloging with whatever external support they can attract. The progress is real. It is also slow. The third reality is access restriction, and here the characterization of refusal is most fair. Some monastery libraries actively limit access in ways that go beyond resource constraints. Individual abbots can and do refuse visiting scholars. The special permit system for entering Mount Athos, a maximum of 110 Orthodox and 10 non-Orthodox men per day, means that even scholars who have institutional permission to do research must compete for access slots. Women cannot enter the peninsula at all, which means that a significant portion of the world's manuscript scholars are categorically excluded. This is not a resource limitation. It is a deliberate policy rooted in monastic tradition. It has real consequences for scholarship. The fourth reality is selective access. Some of what the monasteries hold has been examined by scholars, but those scholars have published findings in academic journals and specialized monographs that are not widely accessible to the public. There is a gap between what is known to specialists and what is known to the general public, and that gap is often read as secrecy when it is actually a failure of science communication. But the gap is real. Fifth, there are specific documents that are restricted for reasons that are themselves not publicly stated. The patriarchal archives in Istanbul, the restricted sections of the Vatican collections, certain monastery libraries on Athos that have not been open to outside scholars in decades. In these cases, the institutional answer to the question of what they contain is simply, we will not say. Whether what they contain is of world historical significance or of purely internal institutional relevance is impossible to know from outside. That is, precisely, the definition of a restriction. Across the history of Byzantine manuscript scholarship, there have been enough surprising discoveries to make any scholar hesitate before declaring that nothing new can emerge from the remaining unexamined collections. The Archimedes palimpsest, hiding major mathematical discoveries inside a prayer book for 700 years, is perhaps the most dramatic example. But it is not the only one. At St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, not an Athos monastery but one of the oldest in the world, founded in the 6th century, researchers using multispectral imaging discovered in 2017 that the monastery's collection included previously unreadable text on manuscripts that had been overlooked or misidentified. Among the recovered texts were early Christian writings, Syriac homilies, Arabic documents, and Greek texts that scholars had not known the monastery possessed. The total tally of newly identified texts runs to several hundred distinct items, including what appears to be previously unknown poetry by Greek writer Meander. This discovery came not from a new archive, but from new technology applied to materials that had been sitting in the library for centuries, inadequately catalogued. If St. Catherine's, which has been studied by Western scholars since the 19th century, could yield such a haul, what might the less examined collections of Mount Athos contain? The question is not rhetorical. Scholars who have worked on the Athonite collections consistently note that the level of description in existing catalogues is highly uneven. Some manuscripts have been given detailed codicological analysis. Others appear in catalogues with nothing more than a brief title and an estimated date. Palimpsests, manuscripts written over erased earlier text, are particularly likely to be underestimated in this way because the lower text is invisible without specialized imaging. Vatapedi Monastery, with its 35,000 manuscripts and rare books, is particularly significant in this regard. The monastery has been cautious about outside access. Significant cataloging work was done in collaboration with Greek scholars in the late 20th and early 21st century, but large portions of the collection remain inadequately described. Whether any of those undescribed manuscripts contain material of the caliber of the Archimedes palimpsest, or even of the caliber of a previously unknown classical text, is genuinely unknown, not unknowable. Unknown. There is a difference. At the Patriarchal Library, the collaboration with the Morgan Library announced in 2021 has the potential to bring new attention to materials that have been effectively inaccessible to outside scholars. The Morgan Library specializes in medieval manuscripts and has considerable expertise in conservation and imaging. If the collaboration proceeds as announced and produces a publicly accessible catalog and digitized collection, it could represent a significant opening of the Patriarchal Archive to scholarly attention for the first time. The honest frontier of this inquiry is this: we do not know what we are missing. We know that the collections are large, that they are incompletely cataloged, that access has been restricted, and that the history of similar collections elsewhere has produced major discoveries when examined properly. We do not know whether the next discovery is waiting in a Vatapedi monastery cabinet, or whether everything significant has already been found. That uncertainty is itself a kind of argument for continued investment in digitization, for negotiated access agreements between monastic communities and academic institutions, and for the patient, respectful work of scholarship that does not treat religious communities as obstacles to knowledge but as custodians of tradition, who have their own valid relationship with the past they preserve. To understand what it means to lose a manuscript forever, it helps to sit with a specific case, not a library burning. That is too large to comprehend emotionally. One book, one man, one decision. George Gemistos Plethon was the most original philosopher of the Byzantine world's final century. He was not a theologian, or rather, he was something more disturbing to Orthodox sensibility than a theologian. He was a genuine Platonist who seems to have believed deeply and personally in a kind of reformed ancient religion, rooted in the philosophy of Plato and the Neoplatonists. He spent most of his life in Mistras in the Peloponnese, not in Constantinople, running what amounted to an informal Platonic academy. When he attended the Council of Florence in 1438, his lectures on Plato were so striking that Cosimo de' Medici decided, on the spot, to found the Platonic Academy of Florence. That academy, and its successor institutions, shaped the course of Renaissance philosophy. Platon's great work, the Nomoi, or Book of Laws, was a systematic philosophical text, arguing for a return to what he called the ancient way, a kind of Hellenic polytheism recast in Neoplatonic terms. He wrote it over decades, refined it, and kept it close. He knew it was dangerous. In the theological climate of the dying Byzantine Empire, where Orthodox rigorists and Roman Catholics were fighting over the soul of a civilization, a philosopher arguing for the rehabilitation of the pagan gods was not going to find a sympathetic audience. He never published it widely. When Platon died in 1452, the manuscript passed eventually to Gennadios Scholarios, the man who became the first Orthodox patriarch under Ottoman rule, Mehmed's appointed head of the Greek millet. Scholarios and Plethon had been intellectual enemies for decades. Scholarios was a committed Aristotelian and an orthodox rigorist. Plethon's Platonism struck him as apostasy. When the manuscript arrived in his possession, Scholarios made his decision. He burned it. Around 1460, he burned what he explicitly knew to be the only surviving copy of the most significant original philosophical work produced in Byzantine civilization's final generation. He then wrote a letter to the Exarch Joseph describing what he had done and summarizing the contents chapter by chapter to demonstrate the heresy of the book and justify his action. That letter survives. The book does not. What did the nomoi actually argue? From Scholarios' summary, the only source we have, it seems to have proposed a systematized pagan theology based on Platonic principles, with the Olympian gods reconceived as aspects of the divine. It apparently included hymns to these reinterpreted deities, a calendar of religious observances, and a detailed cosmological and ethical system. Whether it was a genuine attempt to revive paganism or a sophisticated philosophical allegory is something we cannot know, because we cannot read it. Scholarios decided we should not read it, and his decision has held for 565 years. This is what the destruction of a manuscript means. Not the loss of information in the abstract, the permanent foreclosure of a question. We will never know what Plethon fully believed. We will never know whether his system contained insights that would have mattered. We will never be able to evaluate his argument on its merits, because the argument is gone. Scholarios won that debate in the only way a debate can be won definitively, by making sure the other side cannot speak. Every person reading this, in the modern world, has benefited from the work of men they will never know, and whose names are mostly lost. The monks and scribes of Byzantium, the ones who sat in stone rooms in 9th century Constantinople tracing Greek minuscule letters onto stretched parchment, the ones who stayed at their desks when empires were collapsing around them, the ones who packed manuscripts onto ships when cities burned. Those people are the reason that Western civilization has the texts that it does. Without Byzantine preservation of Plato, no Renaissance Platonism, no Platonic Academy of Florence, no Ficino, no Pico, no Bruno, no influence of Platonic thought on Renaissance art, architecture, theology, or political theory. Without Byzantine preservation of Aristotle, no medieval scholasticism as we know it. Aquinas could not have written the Summa Theologica without Aristotle, and he would not have had Aristotle without Byzantine transmission through the Arab world and back to the Latin West. Without Byzantine preservation of the Greek medical corpus, Galen and Hippocrates and Dioscorides would be names without texts, and the history of medicine would be missing its foundational literature. The scale of the debt is not rhetorical exaggeration. It is demonstrable, traceable, and real. The route from a 10th century Byzantine scriptorium to the philosophy curriculum of a 21st century university is a straight line with nothing missing except the individual human beings who held it together at every link. This is why the question of what Mount Athos holds, what the patriarchal archives contain, what the restricted sections of the Vatican library include. These are not questions of academic interest only. They are questions about what civilization knows about itself. The manuscripts that survived are not relics. They are active. They continue to be studied, translated, interpreted, and taught. Each one that remains unexamined is a question that has not yet been asked. The Orthodox Church, in its monasteries, its patriarchate, its various archives, holds the most significant collection of Byzantine manuscripts remaining in the world. It holds them as a matter of faith. These texts are sacred to the communities that preserved them. The tension between that understanding and the secular academic understanding of the same texts as heritage belonging to all humanity is not resolvable by argument. It requires the patient development of relationships, the kind of relationship that Cardinal Bessarion built with the Republic of Venice in the 15th century, or that Nicephorus Blemmydes built with the monastery libraries of Macedonia in the 13th. Relationships based on mutual respect and shared recognition of what is at stake. What was lost in 1204 is gone. What was lost in 1453 is gone. What was deliberately destroyed? Plethons nomoi, countless unnamed texts scraped from palimpsests, works that burned without even leaving a record of their titles, is gone. We grieve those losses in the abstract, because we cannot grieve them specifically. We do not know enough about what they contained to know how to mourn them properly. But what remains is not gone. What remains is in those stone libraries on a Greek peninsula, in restricted Vatican cabinets, in the patriarchal compound in Istanbul, in monastery libraries across Greece and the former Byzantine world. Much of it has been seen. Some of it has not. We should care, with urgency, about which is which. There is an argument that the modern situation, partially digitized, incompletely cataloged, access complicated by monastic tradition, is actually not so different from what it has always been. Byzantine manuscripts have always been scattered, imperfectly cataloged, and access limited by the physical and political realities of the communities that held them. What is different now is not the situation, but the technology available to address it. The great digitization projects of the past 2 decades represent something genuinely new in the history of manuscript scholarship. The Vatican's DigiVatlib has put tens of thousands of manuscripts online, available to anyone with an internet connection. The Pandectus repository has digitized over 5,000 Athonite manuscripts. The Library of Congress microfilm collection from Mount Athos, while dated, provides descriptions and images of hundreds of manuscripts. The British Library digitized manuscripts collection includes Byzantine materials acquired over centuries. The Marciana in Venice has digitized core parts of the Bessarion collection, multispectral imaging and X-ray fluorescence. The technologies used on the Archimedes palimpsest are now being applied systematically to collections that were previously examined only with the naked eye. St. Catherine's Monastery allowed a team of researchers using these techniques to examine over 1,000 manuscripts, discovering, as noted earlier, several hundred previously unknown texts. The Early Manuscripts Electronic Library, or ML, coordinated that project and is working with other institutions on similar surveys. The Athos Digital Heritage Project ran for 4 years and digitized an enormous quantity of material, not just manuscripts, but icons, metalwork, textiles, architectural drawings, and over 500 hours of audiovisual recordings. It was a Greek government initiative, and it represented a genuine investment in making the Athonite heritage accessible. But even that project, ambitious as it was, did not constitute a complete scholarly catalog of the monastery manuscripts. Digitizing an image and cataloging a manuscript at a scholarly level are different things. The first requires a camera and a storage system. The second requires a trained paleographer who can date the script, identify the copyist's hand, describe the content accurately, note textual variants, and cross-reference with other known manuscripts. The true bottleneck in Byzantine manuscript scholarship is not images, it is expertise. There are far more Byzantine manuscripts waiting to be cataloged than there are Byzantine paleographers in the world. The field is small, demanding, and poorly funded. The number of scholars who can read Byzantine minuscule at the level required for accurate manuscript description is limited. This is a structural problem that technology alone cannot solve. It requires sustained investment in training the next generation of scholars, which in turn requires universities and funding bodies to recognize that Byzantine manuscript studies is not an antiquarian hobby, but a living scholarly field with irreplaceable contributions to make. The monasteries, for their part, are not indifferent to this argument. Many abbots understand, and some actively advocate, that digitization and cataloging serve both scholarly and monastic purposes. A properly cataloged manuscript is more easily identified if it is stolen or damaged. A digitized collection is accessible to Orthodox communities around the world, who care about their heritage but cannot travel to Mount Athos. The monastery's stewardship is actually enhanced, not threatened, by scholarly collaboration done respectfully. That understanding is not universal among the Athonite communities, but it is growing. Among the most haunting aspects of the manuscript losses of Constantinople is the category of texts we know existed because other ancient writers mentioned them, but which no copy has ever been found. These are the books we know by name and by reputation, but cannot read. Their absence is not theoretical. It is a specific, documented silence at the center of human knowledge. Aristophanes wrote at least 40 plays. 11 survive. The other 29 are gone. We know some of their titles: the Aeolocikon, the Amphiaros, the Acharnes. We have fragments, a line here, a quoted passage there, but not the plays themselves. They survived into the Byzantine period as texts. There are references to Byzantine scholars reading them in the 9th and 10th century. At some point between then and now, they disappeared. Some may have been lost in the chaos of 1204. Others may have been in collections that simply were not copied often enough to survive multiple disasters. Sophocles wrote a reported 123 plays. 7 survive. The Athenian theatrical tradition has been reduced by 94%. Again, we know some of the titles. We have fragments. We know, from ancient critics, what some of the lost plays argued and how they were structured. We cannot read them. Of the works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, the earliest Greek thinkers, the founders of Western philosophical inquiry, almost nothing survives as complete text. Heraclitus, Parmenides, Anaximander, Empedocles. We have fragments, often quoted by later writers who were themselves quoting at second or third hand. The original works were in Byzantine libraries in some form for centuries. They did not survive. In the field of mathematics, Apollonius of Perga wrote a great work on conic sections in 8 books. 4 books survive in Greek. 4 more survive only in Arabic translation. Whether the Arabic translation was made from a Byzantine copy that no longer exists, or from an independent tradition, is not entirely settled. Diophantus wrote an Arithmetica in 13 books. 6 survive in Greek and 4 more in Arabic. 7 books are missing entirely. In medicine, Galen was extraordinarily prolific, writing hundreds of treatises. Many survive, many do not. Of the works that do survive, some exist only because Byzantine scholars copied them. The rest of the ancient world had already lost them. Of the works that do not survive, some may still be in monastery libraries unrecognized, filed under generic titles, their true content invisible to a casual catalog description. This is why the incompletely cataloged monasteries of Mount Athos matter. Not because there is a specific reason to believe that any particular lost work of Sophocles or Apollonius is sitting in a Vatapedi cabinet, but because the history of manuscript discoveries has consistently demonstrated that what appears to be cataloged is not always what is actually there. The Archimedes palimpsest appeared in an inventory as a prayer book. The discoveries at St. Catherine's Monastery came from materials that had been sitting in a supposedly well-known collection for a century. The history of what we thought we knew about ancient texts has been revised repeatedly by the examination of manuscripts that scholars assumed held nothing new. The story of Byzantine manuscripts is usually told as a story of loss, of fire and looting and conquest and the slow attrition of time. But there is another story running alongside it, one that is less dramatic and far less discussed, about what the Orthodox Church actually did preserve, and how, and why. The Byzantine liturgical tradition is itself a text. The Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is celebrated in Orthodox churches around the world today, every Sunday, was codified in Constantinople in the late 4th or early 5th century, and has been transmitted continuously since then. It is sung in the same melodic patterns, Byzantine chant, using the 8-tone system codified by St. John of Damascus in the 8th century, that it was sung in during the Byzantine Empire. The church music is a living manuscript, performed, not stored. It survived not because it was written in a codex that could be saved from a fire, but because it was memorized, practiced, and transmitted by generations of chanters and clergy. The iconographic tradition is similar. The theological rules governing the representation of sacred figures in Byzantine icons, what colors to use, what gestures to depict, how to show the relationship between the divine and human natures of Christ, were codified in conciliar decisions and transmitted through the training of icon painters across centuries. The Painter's Manual of Dionysius of Forna, compiled in the early 18th century, and based on much older traditions, preserves iconographic rules that trace back to the pre-iconoclast period of Byzantine Christianity. That manual was held at Mount Athos and remains a living reference for Orthodox icon painters today. This is not incidental to the story of manuscripts. It is central to understanding why the monasteries of Mount Athos exist, and why the monks who guard those manuscript collections have a different relationship to them than secular archivists would. For the monks, the manuscripts are not historical documents. They are part of a living tradition that encompasses the liturgy they sing, the icons they venerate, the patristic writings they read, and the monastic rules they follow. The past and the present are not separated by a scholarly wall. They are continuous. This continuity is, in fact, what makes the Orthodox Church's manuscript heritage both more and less accessible than it might otherwise be. More accessible because the texts are not exotic museum pieces. They are read, prayed over, and referenced as living theological sources. Less accessible because they are embedded in a tradition that has its own hierarchy of importance, its own reading protocols, its own sense of what a text is for. A Byzantine theological manuscript that has been in active liturgical use in a monastery for 600 years is not the same kind of object as a classical text that has been unread for the same period. The monks know the first category. They may have no idea what the second contains. On the 29th of May, 1453, the monk Gennadios, or someone like him, someone whose name we do not know, ran through the burning streets of Constantinople carrying whatever he could save. The city that had preserved civilization's memory for 1100 years was ending. What he chose to carry shaped, in some small way, what we know. We tell this story not as accusation, but as reckoning. The Orthodox Church, in its monasteries, its patriarchate, its dispersed communities across the former Byzantine world, is the custodian of a heritage that belongs, in a meaningful sense, to all humanity. The monks of Mount Athos did not create that heritage. They received it, maintained it, and transmitted it across conditions that would have destroyed institutions with shallower roots. They deserve acknowledgement for that. They also deserve the honest observation that the world cannot evaluate what it cannot see. The lost manuscripts of Constantinople are lost in 3 different ways. Some are lost forever, burned in 1204 or 1453, or in the smaller fires of ordinary time, or deliberately destroyed as Plethen's Nomoi was destroyed. Those losses are permanent, and we have learned to live with them by building our culture from what survived. Some are lost in plain sight, photographed, microfilmed, cataloged at low resolution, but not yet examined at the level of scholarship that would reveal their full content. These losses are recoverable with investment and access, and some are lost behind walls of institutional access restriction, not secret in the conspiratorial sense, but not open in the scholarly sense, held by communities whose relationship with them is devotional rather than academic. The question the 21st century faces is whether the remarkable technologies now available, multispectral imaging, X-ray fluorescence, artificial intelligence-assisted transcription, high-resolution digitization, can be brought to bear on those second and third categories before time makes them permanent losses. The manuscripts are not immortal. Parchment ages, bindings deteriorate, humidity and temperature fluctuations damage inks. The texts that have survived 1200 years of human disaster are not immune to the slower catastrophe of neglect. What would it take to change this? Sustained negotiation between secular institutions and monastic communities based on mutual respect rather than competing claims. adequate funding for both conservation and scholarly cataloging, training of the next generation of Byzantine paleographers, so that the expertise required to examine these materials does not itself become extinct, and from the monastic side, a recognition, which some abbots already hold, that making these materials accessible serves rather than threatens the mission of preservation. The Archimedes palimpsest was sold at auction in 1998 and revealed, through science, mathematical insights that changed our understanding of ancient genius. It was hiding in plain sight inside a prayer book for 700 years. The next discovery of that caliber may be in a monastery library on Mount Athos, in a cabinet that has not been opened by an outside scholar in a generation. Or it may not be. We will not know until we look. Let us end not with what was lost, but with what, against all probability, was saved. Because the story of the Manuscripts of Constantinople is not only a tragedy, it is also, improbably, a story of survival. We have all 37 dialogues of Plato, because Byzantine scribes copied them, copied the copies, and made copies of those, and because Cardinal Bessarion assembled them in Venice, and because the Republic of Venice accepted his gift. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey, copied in Constantinople across 1,000 years from Homeric manuscripts that the Library of Alexandria had worked to establish in the 2nd century BC. We have the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, reduced, but not to zero. We have the complete Aristotle that the medieval and Renaissance world built its philosophy around. We have Galen and Hippocrates and Euclid and Ptolemy and Archimedes. We have the Greek New Testament in manuscripts that trace back to the scriptorium of Constantinople. We have the theological writings of the Church Fathers that define Orthodox Christianity today. The Vienna Dioscorides, the magnificent illuminated herbal created in Constantinople around 512 AD for the Princess Anisha Juliana, survives in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, its miniature paintings intact, its botanical illustrations as precise and beautiful as they were 1,500 years ago. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest complete New Testaments, copied in the 4th century, was found at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai in the 19th century and is now held in the British Library. The Biblioteca Marciana in Venice holds the living core of Bessarion's collection, the ark that he built for a civilization that was drowning. And on Mount Athos, surrounded by the Aegean Sea, accessible only by boat, closed to women, governed by a theological time that moves more slowly than the secular world, 11,000 manuscripts wait. Some have been examined by every scholar who has asked. Others have been seen by no outside eye in living memory. They are not secret in the sense of conspiracy. They are secret in the older sense, held close, kept within, belonging to a world that operates by different rules than the world outside the peninsula's boundaries. The monk who ran through the burning streets in 1453, carrying his manuscripts toward whatever safety remained, was making the oldest human choice, that certain things are worth saving at any cost. The men who guard those manuscripts today are, in their own way, still making that choice. The question is whether they can be persuaded, respectfully, patiently, without coercion, to let the rest of the world share in what they keep. The history of manuscript preservation is a history of exactly those negotiations. Some succeeded, some did not. The work is not finished. It has never been finished. And it will not be finished until every manuscript has been read, described, and made safe from the indifferent passage of time.